The official NASA procedures for contact with intelligent extraterrestrial life. Probability of contact. Over the last few decades, it has become evident that there are a vast number of planets in our galaxy. Virtually every other star we have aimed a telescope at has a planet that orbits it, if not multiple planets. Granted, the majority of these are not conducive to life, but since there are more than 100 billion stars in our galaxy alone, if even only a fraction of a percent have a habitable planet around them, then there would still be hundreds of millions of planets capable of supporting life. It stands to reason, then, that there could be millions of planets out there where intelligent life has evolved, and certainly some of them may be far ahead of us technologically, possessing the ability and desire to travel to planets such as ours. Therefore, it is not so much a question of if we will ever have contact with intelligent life from another planet, but when. This manual has been designed to facilitate such a landmark event. NASA's Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs, DEXA, has been planning for this eventuality for decades, assembling an incredible staff of astronomers, astrobiologists, linguists, doctors, engineers, and military specialists who are all working together to ensure that when the date of alien contact arrives, everything will proceed without a hitch. Chapter 2, Space Madness. Lunar Day 252, still awfully freaking early in the morning. "Who was that?" Dad asked over the radio, sounding worried. Instead of answering, Nina told us, "Come back right now. That's an order." And then she was gone. Obviously, we were no longer her number one priority. "Dash," Dad began. I could hear the sadness in his voice. He obviously felt bad about cutting off our game of catch. "I'm on my way back," I told him. Goofing around on the lunar surface didn't seem right if someone was in trouble. I bounded back toward MBA as quickly as I could, concerned about what might be happening. NASA had assured us that life on the moon would be as safe as life on Earth, but like so many other promises the agency had made, that had not turned out to be true. Dr. Holtz had been murdered, Nina had almost died when her space helmet broke, and Kira and I had nearly been killed by a meteorite shower. And that didn't include the dangers of rocket explosions, malfunctions in the base's life support systems, or dozens of other potentially deadly issues. Life on the moon was basically long stretches of boredom, punctuated by quick bursts of terror. Dad and I entered the airlock, shut the outer door, depressurized the inner chamber, and clambered out of our suits. Normally, we would have cleaned the moon dust off of them right away, but since this was a potential emergency, we left them piled on the airlock floor and slipped back into the base. Even though it was extremely early in the morning, MBA was now buzzing with activity like a stirred-up anthill. Our fellow Moonies, wakened by the scream, were drowsily staggering out of their residences, rubbing sleep from their eyes and trying to figure out what was going on. There were 2 levels of residences at MBA. The upper one exited onto a catwalk that overlooked the airlock staging area, so we could see everyone on both levels as they emerged. Upstairs, Dr. Elena Brahmaputra Marquez, our astrophysicist, was advising her children, Cesar, Roddy, and Inez, to stay in their room while she investigated the situation, although her husband, Dr. Timothy Marquez, our base psychiatrist, looked more nervous than any of his children. Now, back on Earth, Dr. Marquez had written a best-selling book on psychiatry, but as my parents often pointed out, that didn't actually mean he was a good psychiatrist. Next door to them, Kira Howard, the only girl my age at MBA, wasn't getting any instruction at all from her father. As usual, Dr. Howard's mind seemed to be somewhere else. He was constantly thinking of new ways to improve life at MBA, and since so many aspects of our lives needed improving, he was always getting distracted, even in the midst of a possible crisis. Downstairs, Dr. Iwanyi, one of our astronomers, had emerged from his room without his family, which probably meant that his wife, Dr. Goldstein, our botanist, and their 7-year-old son, Kamoze, were still asleep or had opted to stay in the room. Meanwhile, Dr. Daphne Merritt, our roboticist, looked like she wished she was still in bed. Normally, Daphne was joyful and chipper, but now she seemed groggy and grumpy. Doctors Kim and Alvarez, our geologist and water extraction specialist respectively, were struggling to put on their robes and slippers, while Dr. Genki, the Peruvian astrobiologist, was engaged in urgent conversation with Dr. Balnikov, the hulking Russian astrophysicist. Meanwhile, Chang Kowalski had already leaped into action. In addition to being our geochemist and resident genius, Chang was also in far better shape than anyone else at MBA. On Earth, he'd been an extreme athlete. Now he still worked out in the gym up to 4 hours a day. Although Chang lived on the first floor, he had already scaled the steps to the second floor catwalk. He was racing toward the Schoberg's tourist suite, which led me to believe that the terrified scream had come from there. I suddenly didn't feel quite so concerned anymore. Now, up to that moment, I had been worried that something bad had happened to someone I liked. However, I hated the Schobergs. I hated them even more than I hated using the space toilet, which was really saying something. They were a family of trillionaires who'd coughed up a ton of money to be the first space tourists, and they were the worst people I had ever met in my life. I wasn't the only one at MBA who felt that way. Everyone else despised them too. Lars and Sonia, the parents, were amoral, abusive, and downright nasty. Patton and Lily, their 16-year-old twins, were brutal and mean. In addition to their general awfulness, the Schobergs had recently sabotaged the base's robotics system to bolster their own investment in a rival lunar tourism business. And as punishment, Nina had taken away all of their comlink privileges so they could no longer communicate with Earth. And since this removed the few things that had given them pleasure, contact with friends, movie and book downloads, access to virtual reality games, the Schobergs were miserable. But rather than apologize and make amends, they had responded by becoming even more obnoxious than before. Even so, it wasn't like I was happy that something bad might have happened to one of them, but I would much rather have something bad happen to a Schoberg than anyone else at MBA. All of the other Moonies were so focused on the Schoberg residence that no one noticed Dad and me returning to base through the airlock. And then Mom emerged onto the catwalk. Violet trailed behind her in her purple Squirrel Force pajamas, half asleep. Except for Nina's residence, ours was the closest to the airlock, almost directly above it. Mom glanced toward the staging area, probably wondering if Dad and I had made it back from outside. So Violet looked our way as well and caught Dad in the act of closing the inner airlock door. She was suddenly wide awake.
Were you just outside?
She exclaimed. Now, even though Violet was quite loud, there was enough going on that no one else heard her, except Chang Kowalski. He spotted us, but instead of saying anything, he simply gave Dad a conspiratorial wink and continued on toward the Schobergs. Dad decided to deal with Violet's question by ignoring it. He quickly sealed the inner airlock door and then called up to Mom. "What's going on?" Before Mom could answer, Violet demanded,
"Why did Dash get to go outside again and not me?"
Mom shushed her and said, "Honey, I'll explain later." Violet put her hands on her hips and gave the biggest pout she could.
"That's not fair."
She was making a big enough scene now that other Moonies paused to look at us, but by this point there was no way to tell that Dad and I had just come through the airlock. Now that we had shrugged off our spacesuits, we were in our usual everyday clothes. And as far as anyone else knew, we might as well have been coming from the communal bathroom, which was on the opposite side of MBA from our residences. "Violet, please," Mom began.
"I never get to do anything fun,"
Violet argued. In exasperation, Mom simply clamped her hand over Violet's mouth and told Dad, "I don't know what's happening. I only heard Sonia scream." Violet continued trying to argue, even though Mom's hand was over her mouth and we couldn't possibly understand her. By now, the rest of the Moonies had gathered around the door to the Schoberg suite. There was a sudden commotion as Nina and Lars emerged into the crowd. I figured Nina must have run right there after cutting off radio communication with us. Even though it was the middle of the night, Nina was in her official moon base commander jumpsuit. I would have assumed that she had slept in it, except it didn't have a single wrinkle. Everything else about Nina was perfectly shipshape as well, from her polished shoes to her tightly shellacked hair. Next to her, Lars Schoberg was completely the opposite. The man was normally slovenly, but now he was disturbingly disheveled. His eyes were glassy, and what little hair he had was standing on end, and he was even paler than usual, which was hard to believe. When Lars had arrived at MBA, he had already been the palest person I'd ever met. An additional 5 months on the moon without any sunlight had rendered him as white as a block of tofu. But tonight there was something unsettling and ghostly about his pallor. He leaned on Nina for support as though his legs weren't working properly, and he seemed very confused. He was still being a total jerk, though, as usual. "Where are you taking me?" he asked Nina angrily. "I demand to know." "I've already told you 3 times, Nina said calmly. "We're going to medical bay. We need to find out what's wrong with you." "Nothing's wrong with me," Lars snapped, pulling away from her. "I'm perfectly fine." "Darling, you're not," Sonia Schoberg said, following her husband out onto the catwalk. She looked far worse than usual as well, only in her case, this was because she wasn't wearing any makeup. Sonia had undergone dozens of plastic surgery operations, vainly reconstructing every bit of her face. Unfortunately, all the adjustments had been designed for Earth gravity, and on the moon, things had gone horribly wrong. Her lips, which had been delicately inflated on Earth, had been ballooned to 3 times their normal size, while the helium micropockets injected into her face to keep her skin from sagging now rose up too high. Normally, Sonia could conceal some of this with makeup, but without it, she looked awfully scary. Several of the Moonies gathered around the door, recoiled in fright. Lars responded to her in something that might have been their native Swedish or possibly delirious gobbledygook. I wouldn't have known the difference. Patton and Lily Schoberg lurked in the doorway to their tourist suite. Lily looked concerned about her father, although not nearly as hysterical as her mother. Patton looked like he was annoyed at his father for waking him up in the middle of the night. "Let's go," Nina said, tugging at Lars' arm. "For the last time, I don't need your help," Lars snapped. "I'm as healthy as can be." He yanked his arm away from Nina with such force that he stumbled backwards, slamming into the catwalk railing, flipping over it, and tumbling to the floor below. "Lars!" Sonia screamed. Now on Earth, such a fall might have badly injured Lars, but in the moon's low gravity, he didn't land heavily enough to break anything, although he did bonk his head pretty hard. It sounded like a baseball getting thwacked for a home run. Sonia shrieked in horror, the same ear-piercing wail that I'd heard over the radio. But now at close range, it was shrill enough to set my teeth on edge. Dad instinctively hurried to Lars's side to see if he was all right, and I followed. Since everyone else was up on the catwalk, we got to Lars first. He was lying on the floor, spread-eagled, looking even more dazed than before. "How do you feel now?" Dad asked. "I want a panda," Lars said dreamily. Now, rather than circle all the way back to the stairs, Nina and Chang both leaped over the catwalk railing and landed next to us, even though Nina would have chewed me out if she ever caught me doing that. Dr. Marquez stayed on the catwalk and peered over the railing. "He's obviously suffering from some sort of delirium," he announced. "Oh, you think?" Chang asked sarcastically. He had a very low opinion of Dr. Marquez's medical skills. And given that Chang was a genius on the level of Einstein, I would bet that he was right. Unfortunately, we didn't have another doctor at MBA. Our previous one had been murdered, and his replacement wasn't due to arrive for another week. So for the time being, we were making do with Chang's general knowledge of medicine and Dr. Marquez's questionable knowledge of it. Sonia was now crying hysterically and babbling in Swedish. Mom and Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez did their best to comfort her, leading her back into her suite to sit her down. "There's no need to panic," Mom said reassuringly. "Lars is in good hands." Sonia gave another teeth-rattling wail in response. Lars was still lying on the floor, smiling vacantly at us, unaware of his wife's concern. "Would any of you like a panda?" he asked us. "I'm gonna buy them for everyone."
Me!
Violet exclaimed, raising her hand excitedly.
I want 2 pandas.
"Lars is a lot nicer when he's delirious," Dad observed. "Yeah, by a factor of 1,000, Chang agreed. "We should have whacked him on the head 5 months ago." Nina frowned, again failing to find the humor in anything. "Do you think it's hypoxia?" she asked Chang. Hypoxia is oxygen deficiency, and since there's no oxygen on the moon, we have to generate and recycle it. And since humans can only survive without oxygen for about 3 minutes, oxygen levels were among the most carefully monitored data at MBA. Everyone, even the little kids, had been instructed how to recognize the signs of hypoxia, so I knew them well. Shortness of breath, elevated heart rate, sweating, wheezing, confusion, and dramatic change of skin color. And although most people associate blue skin with oxygen deprivation, the skin of a hypoxic person can turn other colors, like cherry red. Now that I thought about it, Lars's breathing sounded a bit labored, although his skin certainly hadn't changed color. It remained as pale and colorless as skin could be. To my surprise, Chang gave me an uneasy glance before answering Nina, as though concerned that she had mentioned this in front of me. And then he said, "I don't think this is hypoxia." "Well, then what is it?" Nina asked. "I don't know," Chang admitted. Nina scowled, disappointed. "You don't have any ideas at all?" "Oh, I have plenty of ideas," Chang said, "but I don't know if any of them are right. We need to call Mission Control and talk to a doctor." "I'm on it," Nina said, and then hustled into the medical bay. "Well, why don't you let me look at him?" Dr. Marquez said, even though he made no effort to check on Lars so far. "I'm a doctor." "No, I meant a real doctor," Chang corrected. "You know, one who actually knows what he's doing." Dr. Marquez grew offended. "I am a real doctor, and I wrote a best-selling book about medicine." "You mean about pop psychology," Chang reminded him. "If Lars has trouble finding his happy place, we'll call you. But for now, we need to get him to medical bay." He looked at Lars. "Can you stand up?" "I can do a lot of things," Lars said cheerfully. "I can even sing 'I'm a Little Teapot' in Dutch. Would you like to hear that?" No," Chang said quickly. "I'd like you to stand up and walk to medical bay with me." Lars tried to get to his feet. He also decided to show us that he could sing in Dutch anyhow. "Ich bin ein beetje waterkoker," he began. Lars still looked unsteady, so Dad and Chang grabbed his arms and helped him stand. The medical bay was only a few feet from where Lars had fallen, so it didn't take long to walk him there. Lars kept singing the whole way. He had a terrible singing voice. It sounded like someone was strangling a cat. I was relieved once they got inside the clinic and shut the door, muting the sound. By now, many of the Moonies had made it downstairs. Violet, Kira Howard, and Roddy Marquez joined me. "What do you think's wrong with him?" Kira asked. Although she'd only been at MBA for 2 months, she was my best friend there. Not that she had much competition for this. Now, Kira was scary smart, although she tended to think that rules were for other people.
"Yeah," Violet said, mimicking Kira's posture. "What do you think is wrong with him?"
Violet had really taken to Kira and often modeled her behavior reverently. "Looks to me like he has space madness," Roddy said, which was his go-to explanation for any inexplicable behavior at MBA. Roddy was always quick to offer up his opinion on things, whether you wanted it or not. He generally had a 50% chance of being right. He did know a lot about science, but he also got too wrapped up in sci-fi conspiracy theories. "There's no such thing as space madness," Kira said disdainfully.
"Yeah," Violet seconded. "There's no such thing."
Yeah, there is," Roddy insisted, "but NASA has covered it up. Half of the people who came up here to build this base went crazy. Spending long periods of time away from Earth and in cramped spaces can seriously damage your brain." "Well, it certainly damaged yours," Kira said. "Or were you already a psycho when you got up here?"
"Boom!" Kira crowed. "She got you good."
"Ha ha," Roddy sneered. "If space madness doesn't exist, then what's going on with Lars right now? It looks pretty insane to me." "I'd guess ergot contamination," Kira said.
"Yeah," Violet said. "It's probably bear's knot contamination."
"Ergot contamination," I corrected. "Ergot is a fungus that grows on cereals, and if you eat it, it can cause hallucinations and things."
What kind of cereal?" Violet asked, sounded worried. Like Fruity Puffs?"
"No, not cereals like that," I said. "Stuff like rye and wheat." Violet heaved a sigh of relief.
Oh, phew, because I love Fruity Puffs. I don't want my head getting contaminated.
Fruity Puffs are made from wheat, dummy, Roddy said. And besides, NASA irradiates all our food and then hermetically seals it before it gets up here, so it couldn't possibly get contaminated. He gave Kira a superior smirk. So, Kira said, you think NASA has this huge conspiracy to keep us from learning about space madness, and yet you completely trust them with the safety of our food. Roddy's smirk faded. Well,
Yeah, who's the dummy now? Violet asked him. Here's a hint. It's you.
She raised her hand for a high five and Kira slapped it. Around us, the other Moonies were also discussing what could possibly be wrong with Lars. Most of them seemed to think either some form of food contamination or stress was behind it. Although Cesar Marquez, Roddy's dim older brother, was suggesting that it might have been some kind of sweetest brain disease, I overheard Dr. Merritt tell Dr. Iwanyi, I don't know what it could be, but if it keeps Lars from being a jerk, we shouldn't cure it. Mom emerged from the Schoberg suite onto the catwalk, looking frazzled after dealing with Sonia. Everyone looked to her expectantly, and I noticed that Sonia's wailing had stopped. She's calm now, Mom reported. Elena gave her a sedative. Dr. Janke asked, Did Sonia give any indication of what happened with Lars? Only that it seemed to come out of nowhere, Mom replied. She said she woke up and found him pacing around their suite, babbling deliriously. It's space madness, Roddy exclaimed triumphantly. Just like I thought. Oh, give it a rest, loser, Cesar chided. Violet giggled at this. Roddy turned the color red we were supposed to associate with hypoxia. Most likely he was upset because Cesar had insulted him in front of Kira, who he had a crush on. Oh yeah, you want proof that I'm right? He challenged. Let's get proof. Nina's probably on the comm link with the doctor right now. Let's go see what she says. He stormed toward the door of the medical bay. Roddy, Mom yelled, do not disturb them. This is an emergency. But Roddy didn't listen. He was too determined to prove that he was right. Mom looked to me for help, as I was a lot closer to Roddy than she was. Roddy, wait, I said, and started after him. Before I could stop him, though, Roddy sprang the last few steps to the medical bay door and threw it open. So I ended up with a very good view of what was happening inside. Lars was laid out on the examination table, and Dad and Chang were pinning him down while Nina held a syringe. A small yellow case marked with a skull and crossbones sat on the table. A doctor was talking them through the procedure on the comm link, her face taking up the entire slim screen. Once he has inhaled the amyl nitrate, she was saying, then give him the shot. The adults all wheeled on Roddy as he entered. Roddy! Nina barked. Get out of here! She was so angry, even Roddy understood that he better not push his luck. He quickly backed up and closed the door. But I'd seen and heard enough. I had paid plenty of attention to our medical briefings, and I had dutifully read all the sections about emergencies in the official resident's guide to Moonbase Alpha as well. So I knew exactly what the yellow case with the skull and crossbones was for. Lars Schoberg didn't have space madness. He'd been poisoned.